Good evening, my fellow citizens. This government, as promised, has maintained the closest surveillance of the Soviet military buildup on the island of Cuba. Within the past week, unmistakable evidence has established the fact that a series of offensive missile sites is now in preparation on that imprisoned island. The purpose of these bases can be none other than to provide a nuclear strike capability against the Western Hemisphere. We will not prematurely or unnecessarily risk the course of worldwide nuclear war, in which even the fruits of victory would be ashes in our mouth. But neither will we shrink from that risk at any time it must be faced.
On August 6th and 9th, 1945, in an effort to end the war in the Pacific, the United States dropped 2 atomic bombs on the Japanese cities of Hiroshima and Nagasaki. The bomb dropped on Hiroshima, known as Little Boy, was a uranium gun-type atomic bomb. Despite the devastation, Emperor Hirohito did not immediately surrender, prompting the U.S. to drop a second bomb on Nagasaki. This bomb, called Fat Man, was a plutonium implosion-type device. The combined destruction from these bombings, along with the Soviet Union's declaration of war on Japan, finally convinced Emperor Hirohito to surrender to the Allies, effectively ending World War II. These bombings not only marked the dawn of nuclear warfare, but also signaled the start of a new era, a technological arms race between the United States and the Soviet Union that would evolve into the Cold War. While the U.S. had demonstrated its technological superiority, this show of force set off an ideological and political rivalry that shaped global tensions for decades. Shortly after the war's end, British writer George Orwell penned an essay titled "You and the Atomic Bomb," published on October 19, 1945, in the British newspaper Tribune. Reflecting on the world's post-war reality, Orwell foresaw a future overshadowed by the threat of nuclear conflict. He drew from James Burnham's predictions of a polarized global landscape, noting that, looking at the world as a whole, the drift for many decades has been not towards anarchy, but towards the reimposition of slavery. James Burnham's theory has been much discussed, but few people have yet considered its ideological implications. That is, the kind of worldview, the kind of beliefs, and the social structure that would probably prevail in a state which was at once unconquerable and in a permanent state of Cold War with its neighbors. The term Cold War came to represent this period of tension between the two superpowers. Though they never engaged in direct large-scale combat, the US and the USSR backed opposing sides in regional conflicts, proxy wars that kept the world on edge. The Cold War wasn't just a clash of militaries, but a war of ideologies, technologies, information, and intellectual power. Capitalism versus communism, with the world as their stage. Despite this rivalry, both nations came dangerously close to direct confrontation multiple times, each instance threatening to trigger what would have been the first nuclear war. Lavrenti Pavlovich Beria, one of Joseph Stalin's most feared and influential secret police chiefs, played a pivotal role in the Soviet Union's race to develop nuclear weapons. As head of the NKVD from 1938 to 1946, Beria had a reputation for ruthlessness and precision, and when it came to building the USSR's first atomic bomb, he took no chances. Although there was speculation that Soviet scientists could potentially surpass their American counterparts in bomb design, Beria demanded an exact replica of the Fat Man bomb dropped on Nagasaki. He knew that bomb worked, and for him, that certainty outweighed any ambition for innovation. This led to the creation of the Soviet Union's first nuclear bomb, the RDS-1, also known as Device 501 or First Lightning. It was the result of secretive research as part of the Soviet atomic bomb project. On August 29, 1949, at 7 a.m., the bomb was detonated at the Semipalatinsk test site in the Kazakh SSR. The United States, closely monitoring Soviet advancements, gave it the code name Joe-1, a nod to Joseph Stalin. The detonation marked the beginning of the Soviet nuclear era. Following the success of Joe-1, the Soviets wasted no time in continuing their nuclear tests. Two more bombs followed, Joe-2 RDS-2 with a yield of 38.3 kilotons and Joe-3 RDS-3, which reached 42 kilotons. These tests solidified the USSR's position in the nuclear arms race, proving that the Soviets were now a formidable nuclear power on the world stage. Following this event, on January 31, 1950, U.S. President Harry Truman announced the nation's intention to develop a hydrogen bomb. This decision was driven by two alarming developments: the Soviet Union's first successful detonation of a fission bomb in the fall of 1949, and the recent discovery of espionage activities by Klaus Fuchs at Los Alamos. These revelations heightened fears in Washington that the Soviet Union might overtake the U.S. in the nuclear arms race. With this, the race for more potent weapons began. At the time, no one had a clear idea of how to create a functional hydrogen bomb, making Truman's declaration feel somewhat hollow. However, this fear that the Soviets could outpace them spurred U.S. scientists into action. While one group focused on developing the most powerful fission bomb possible, another group, led by Stanislaw Ulam and Edward Teller, worked on a breakthrough in thermonuclear weapon design. By early 1951, these parallel efforts converged on a Pacific testing series scheduled for late 1952. This series, known as Operation Ivy, tested two of the largest bombs ever created. One of these tests, codenamed Mike, where M stands for megaton, marked the dawn of the thermonuclear age. The Mike test was the first to successfully implement the Teller-Ulam design, true thermonuclear fusion. The bomb, known as the Sausage, was designed by the Panda Committee under J. Carson Mark at Los Alamos. Edward Teller, despite his contributions to the theory, declined involvement in its development. This hydrogen bomb, weighing 82 tons and yielding 10.4 megatons, was a two-stage device. Its primary stage was a TX-5 fission bomb, and its secondary stage used liquid deuterium fusion fuel housed in a cylindrical Dewar flask. The entire assembly was encased in a massive steel shell, the largest single forging at the time. The resulting explosion was monumental, one of the most powerful ever seen. The test obliterated the island of Alugjalab, leaving a crater over a mile wide and 164 feet deep. The mushroom cloud, propelled by the explosion, reached 57,000 feet in just 90 seconds and eventually topped out at 120,000 feet. The radioactive fallout spread across the atoll, a haunting reminder of the destructive power mankind had unleashed. This was the true beginning of the thermonuclear era, a time when the threat of global annihilation loomed over the world. The second test of the Operation Ivy, the King test, with the K standing for kiloton, saw the detonation of a powerful device delivered by a B-36H bomber that took off from Kwajalein Island. The bomb exploded just 20 feet lower than the intended altitude, with a circular bombing error of about 570 feet, give or take 35 feet, with the yield of 500 kilotons. While it wasn't the largest fission bomb deliverable at the time, it certainly stretched the boundaries of what was practically possible. This particular device was a prototype of the Mk-18 superalloy bomb, often referred to as the SOB. It incorporated mostly standard components already stockpiled, drawing heavily from the Mk-6D bomb design. However, it utilized the advanced 92-point implosion system from the Mk-13. The major difference was in the pit, the reflector, and core assembly. Instead of the usual uranium-plutonium composite core, this bomb contained approximately 60 kilograms of highly enriched uranium encased in a natural uranium tamper. Altogether, the bomb weighed 8,600 pounds. The development of the Mk-18 was overseen by Ted Taylor at Los Alamos. A crucial challenge in its design was ensuring safety, given the bomb's immense uranium payload, more than 4 times the critical mass needed for a chain reaction. To address this, the team incorporated safety measures involving chains made from aluminum and boron. These chains were placed inside the bomb to absorb neutrons, preventing a premature chain reaction in case the high explosives were triggered accidentally. Only moments before the bomb was dropped were the chains removed, ensuring it could function as intended. By 1953, a clear pattern of nuclear testing had taken shape at the Nevada Proving Ground, NPG. Almost every year, or every other year, depending on whether a Pacific test series was scheduled, a series of nuclear detonations would be conducted over several months. Each test served multiple purposes, ranging from weapon design advancements to preparing the U.S. military for atomic warfare. Operation Upshot Not Hole, conducted in 1953, was a prime example of such a multifaceted test series. It provided crucial technical data for weapon designers, continued the development of new tactical nuclear weapons, and tested devices like the first-ever nuclear artillery shell. These tests also played a significant role in the U.S. military's atomic combat readiness, offering invaluable experience in planning for nuclear warfare. On the civil defense side, the tests provided key information for protecting the population in case of a nuclear attack. Perhaps most significant, however, was that Operation Upshot Not Hole laid the groundwork for the radiation implosion systems that would be used in the world's first deployable thermonuclear weapons, later proof-tested during Operation Castle in 1954. An estimated 18,000 Department of Defense personnel participated in various roles during Upshot Not Hole. They engaged in observer programs, scientific studies, tactical maneuvers, and support activities. The military exercise known as Desert Rock 5 involved all branches of the U.S. Armed Forces. These maneuvers exposed troops to radiation more aggressively than in earlier exercises. Troop formations were positioned at what was calculated to be the minimum safe distance from the detonations, and many soldiers witnessed multiple tests. According to the radiation exposure limits of that time, 0.3 rem per week and 5 rem per year, participants were expected to remain within relatively safe exposure levels, but around 3,000 soldiers reached or exceeded these limits. Of these, 84 individuals surpassed the annual limit, with the highest exposure recorded at 26.6 rems. Though these levels did not cause immediate symptoms, they slightly increased the long-term risk of cancer.
Yield 15 kilotons. Unlike the situation with an implosion weapon, the scientists were here able to observe fireball growth from a body of fissionable material whose exact shape and dimensions at the moment of detonation were known.
The tests in the Upshot Not Hole series were Annie, 17th March 1953, 16 kilotons; Nancy, 24th March 1953, 24 kilotons; Ruth, 31st March 1953, 0.2 kilotons; Dixie, 6th April 1953, 11 kilotons; Ray, 11th April 1953, 0.2 kilotons; Badger, 18th April 1953, 23 kilotons; Simon, 25th April 1953, 43 kilotons; Encore, 8th May 1953, 27 kilotons; Harry, 19th May 1953, 32 kilotons; Grabble, 25th May 1953, 15 kilotons; Climax, 4th June 1953, 61 kilotons. While the U.S. was conducting these tests, the USSR was swiftly advancing its own nuclear capabilities. On August 12, 1953, the Soviets detonated their first thermonuclear bomb, the RDS-6, also known as Joe 4, with a yield of 400 kilotons. Following this, they carried out a rapid series of tests, Joe 5 or RDS-5 on August 23, 1953, with 28 kilotons, 6 on September 3, 1953, with 5.8 kilotons, 7 on September 8, 1953, with 1.6 kilotons, and 8 on September 10, 1953, with 4.9 kilotons. Each test brought the Soviets closer to establishing their thermonuclear prowess, keeping pace with the U.S. in the unfolding Cold War arms race. In 1954, the United States carried out another significant test series called Operation Castle in the Pacific. Operation Castle was aimed at testing high-yield thermonuclear weapon designs, following the earlier demonstration of the Ulam-Teller design during Operation Ivy. Both U.S. weapons labs, Los Alamos and Lawrence Livermore, were racing to develop deliverable weaponized versions of thermonuclear bombs. Initially, the test schedule included a cryogenic fuel system, similar to the one used in the sausage device, designated EC-16, with the test device named Jughead. However, new approaches were also being explored, and one of these, using non-cryogenic dry fuel made of lithium deuteride, proved to be both a spectacular and disastrous success, far exceeding the anticipated yield. The first test in Operation Castle, known as Castle Bravo, yielded 15 megatons, a shockingly higher output than expected. This caused widespread radioactive fallout, including contamination reaching nearby inhabited atolls. The success of this test, along with others in the series, showcased the United States' leap in thermonuclear weapon design. In fact, 3 of the largest nuclear tests the U.S. ever conducted took place during Operation Castle. Not all of the new designs were successful, however. For instance, the first thermonuclear device tested by the University of California Radiation Laboratory, UCRL, failed. Some systems, tested during Castle, were experimental and not intended for immediate deployment, while others were already on emergency deployment status, even though they had never been tested. One such device, the cryogenic TX-16, was removed from both the test schedule and military service when the solid fuel designs proved more practical. The tests conducted during Operation Castle were Castle Bravo, March 1, 1954, 15 megatons. Castle Romeo, March 27, 1954, 11 megatons. Castle Coon, April 7, 1954, 110 kilotons. Castle Union, April 26, 1954, 6.9 megatons. Castle Yankee, May 5, 1954, 13.5 megatons. Castle Nectar, May 14, 1954, 1.69 megatons. During the same period, the USSR conducted its 1954 nuclear test series, which involved 10 nuclear tests. By 1955, the U.S. was back at it with Operation Teapot, conducting 14 nuclear tests, and Operation Wigwam, a deep underwater explosion test carried out 400 to 500 miles southwest of San Diego, California. The Soviet Union responded with 7 nuclear tests of its own that year. Between 1955 and 1956, the U.S. conducted another series called Project 56, which included 4 nuclear tests at the Nevada test site. After this, the U.S. launched Operation Red Wing, focusing primarily on proving the thermonuclear designs of actual weapons. While Operation Castle had dealt with heavy, first-generation thermonuclear bombs, Red Wing explored new, more innovative second-generation designs. The tests during Red Wing were named after American Indian tribes, birds, and musical instruments. Meanwhile, the USSR conducted 9 more nuclear tests. In 1957, the U.S. carried out Operation Plumbob, a series of 29 nuclear tests. Among them, the test named Hood was the largest atmospheric test ever conducted at the Nevada test site, and in fact, the largest conducted on the continental U.S. This test involved a 2-stage thermonuclear device designed by UCRL, even though the government had publicly stated that no thermonuclear tests were being conducted in Nevada at the time. Plumbob also saw the first nuclear test designed with air-to-air capabilities. At the same time, the USSR was advancing its own nuclear program, conducting 16 nuclear tests in 1957. Notably, the Soviets achieved their first successful air-dropped nuclear explosion via missile with the Z-UR-215 missile, codenamed Joe-29 by the Americans. This period marked the escalating nuclear arms race between the two superpowers, as both nations rapidly developed and tested more advanced and powerful nuclear weapons. Between 1957 and 1958, the United States conducted several key nuclear test series at the Nevada test site, including Project 57, 58, and 58A. These tests focused on compact, lightweight, low-maintenance nuclear weapons, which had important implications for weapon safety. During the era of large, heavy fission bombs, preventing dangerous nuclear reactions was more straightforward, ensuring that the bomb wasn't fully assembled until just before use. However, as nuclear weapons became smaller and more portable, the risks of accidental nuclear detonations increased, making these tests crucial for safety measures. The year 1958 was a landmark in U.S. nuclear testing, with a record-breaking 77 nuclear tests. This surge in testing was driven by two key factors: the looming possibility of a test moratorium, which led weapons labs to push as many devices as possible through the testing pipeline, and the escalating arms race of the 1950s, which was reaching its peak. One of the major test series conducted that year was Operation Hardtack 1 in the Pacific Proving Grounds. This series included 35 tests, making it the largest series up to that point. The tests focused on a variety of strategic nuclear weapons, including intercontinental ballistic missile, ICBM, and submarine-launched ballistic missile, SLBM warheads, as well as high-yield strategic bombs. In total, 35.6 megatons of explosive power were detonated during this series. In addition to Hardtack 1, the U.S. conducted Operation Argus in the South Atlantic. This was a clandestine series of low-yield, high-altitude nuclear tests, primarily designed to study the effects of nuclear explosions in space and on missile trajectories. Argus was the only secret test series during the 17-year history of atmospheric nuclear testing. Later in the year, the U.S. carried out Operation Hardtack 2 at the Nevada test site. Unlike its predecessor, which tested high-yield devices, Hardtack 2 focused on low-yield tests, including many one-point safety tests designed to ensure that accidental detonations would result in minimal yield. Hardtack 2 included 37 tests, making it even larger than Hardtack 1, but the total yield was far lower, at just 45.8 kilotons. Only 18.5 kilotons of this total were detonated above ground, a stark contrast to the 74 kiloton hood shot in the 1957 Operation Plumbob series. This shift reflected growing concern over radioactive fallout and its effects on the U.S. population. While the U.S. was conducting these tests, the Soviet Union was equally active, carrying out 36 nuclear tests during this period. By now, the pattern was clear. Each superpower would develop and test new nuclear weapons, prompting the other to respond with more tests and advancements of their own. This cycle of escalation pushed both the U.S. and the USSR to the brink of nuclear overproduction, as both nations competed to outdo each other in the development and stockpiling of nuclear bombs. Recognizing the dangers of this unchecked arms race, the U.S. and the USSR agreed to a bilateral test moratorium, which officially began on October 31, 1958. This marked a pause in nuclear tests and a brief respite from the intensifying arms race that had defined the preceding decade. The Eisenhower administration had initiated negotiations for a nuclear test ban with the Soviet Union, first announcing this intention on August 22, 1958. As a gesture of goodwill and trust building, Eisenhower also declared a voluntary one-year moratorium on nuclear testing, contingent on the Soviets' commitment to a similar pause. This moratorium, which went into effect on October 31, 1958, was later extended to December 31, 1959. However, on December 29, 1959, the U.S. announced that it would end the voluntary moratorium, although it promised not to resume testing without prior public notice. This decision was likely influenced by the status of the test ban negotiations, which were not progressing well. On January 3, 1960, Soviet Premier Nikita Khrushchev pledged that the USSR would not resume nuclear testing unless the Western nations did so first. The US, the UK, and France did not restart their testing programs, and as a result, there was a testing hiatus that lasted nearly 3 years. However, on August 31, 1961, Khrushchev made a shocking announcement. The Soviet Union would abandon the de facto moratorium and resume nuclear testing. The very next day, on September 1, 1961, the Soviet Union initiated an atmospheric nuclear test series of unprecedented scale. This series, known as the Soviet Union's 1961 Nuclear Test Series, comprised 57 nuclear tests, including some groundbreaking experiments such as live nuclear-tipped missile tests over the sea to land, the first Soviet underground test, and tests involving submarine-launched nuclear rockets and underwater nuclear torpedoes. The most infamous test in this series, however, was Joe 111, conducted on October 30, 1961. Officially known as AN-602, it is more commonly referred to as the Tsar Bomba, the most powerful nuclear weapon ever created and tested. This thermonuclear bomb had an explosive yield of 50 to 58 megatons, making it by far the largest human-made explosion in history. The Tsar Bomba's fireball was so immense that calculations initially suggested it would strike the ground, but the bomb's own shockwave bounced back, preventing this. The fireball spanned 5 miles in width and rose nearly to the altitude from which the plane released it. The explosion's mushroom cloud towered 42 miles high, reaching beyond the stratosphere into the mesosphere.
Осталось 3 секунды. 2, 1, 0. Полевой столб, поднимающийся с земли, быстро увеличился в объеме.
And its cap extended 59 miles wide, with the base of the cloud being 25 miles wide. The flash from the explosion was visible more than 620 miles away, with reports of its visibility reaching as far as Norway, Greenland, and even Alaska. The bomb was so powerful that if detonated over a major U.S. city such as New York, Chicago, San Francisco, or Washington, D.C., not only would the city be obliterated, but large portions of the surrounding suburbs would be rendered lifeless as well. The Tsar Bomba remains the most physically powerful device ever deployed on Earth and dwarfs the largest weapon ever produced by the U.S., the B-41, which had a maximum yield of 25 megatons. Even the largest U.S. nuclear test, Castle Bravo, yielded only 15 megatons, just a fraction of the Tsar Bomba's explosive force. The extraordinary part is that while the Tsar Bomba produced over 50 megatons in its test, the Soviets designed a second variation capable of producing over 100 megatons. However, such a weapon was never tested, sparing the world from an even greater nuclear shockwave. This brief period of resumed testing, marked by such devastating displays of power, highlighted the intensifying nuclear arms race between the US and the USSR, where each superpower sought to outmatch the other's destructive capabilities. The United States launched Operation New GA on September 1961, which ran until June 30, 1962. This series of tests was similar to the earlier Operation Hardtack II, focusing on low-yield tactical nuclear devices. Tests conducted during New GA included thermonuclear primaries, radiation implosion mock-ups, and sealed pit fission devices, often requiring multiple shots to achieve the desired performance and safety. In total, Operation New GA conducted 44 tests, surpassing the previous record held by Hardtack II, which had 37 tests. Due to all these tests being fired underground, very few blast craters were produced, and most of the visible craters were caused by cavity collapses rather than explosions. Consequently, there is little photographic evidence of these tests. One of the few New GA tests with any visual documentation is the Gnome shot, part of the Plowshare program and conducted by the Lawrence Radiation Laboratory. Fired in an underground salt dome, Gnome created a stable cavity 170 feet in diameter and 80 feet high. This rare test cavity avoided collapse, although some radiation was accidentally released during post-shot drilling and was detected off-site. Meanwhile, during Operation New GA at the Nevada test site, the U.S. was also conducting Operation Dominic in the Central Pacific. This simultaneous testing effort responded to the Soviet Union's abandonment of the 34-month nuclear testing moratorium, which they violated on September 1, 1961, by launching a massive series of nuclear tests. New GA, however, remained an underground series focusing on low-yield devices, while the U.S. began preparing for the larger and higher-yield tests. Dominic, officially approved on March 2, 1962, included 36 tests, most of which were weapons development tests designed to evaluate new designs from the weapons labs developed both before and during the moratorium. Among these tests were 5 rocket-launched nuclear shots meant to study nuclear effects at high altitudes, along with tests of operational weapon systems like the Polaris submarine-launched ballistic missile and the ASROC anti-submarine rocket. Within Operation Dominic, the U.S. also conducted Operation Fishbowl, a series of high-altitude nuclear tests in 1962. Fishbowl focused on understanding the effects of nuclear detonations in the upper atmosphere, particularly the electromagnetic pulse, EMP, generated by such explosions. One of the most famous fishbowl tests was Starfish Prime, a high-altitude detonation that caused an unexpectedly large EMP, disrupting electrical systems as far as Hawaii, 900 miles from the test site. The EMP knocked out around 300 streetlights in Honolulu, triggered burglar alarms, and damaged a telephone company microwave link, cutting off communication between the Hawaiian Islands. Operation Dominic and Nougat were not the only nuclear tests being conducted. Between July 1, 1962 and June 30, 1963, the U.S. carried out Operation Storax, the second fiscal year-based test series. Storax concluded just before the signing of the Atmospheric Test Ban Treaty on August 5, 1963, and included the last U.S. atmospheric tests of any description. The majority of Storax tests were underground, like those in Nougat, but with better radiation confinement. One of Storax's tests, Sedan, became famous for being one of the most spectacular nuclear tests fired on U.S. soil. Sedan, conducted as part of the Plowshare program, aimed to assess the potential of clean thermonuclear devices for creating large craters for projects like canal or harbor construction. Detonated at the optimal depth for maximum crater formation, Sedan lifted 12 million tons of soil and rock into the air, creating a crater 1,280 feet wide and 320 feet deep. The explosion released seismic energy equivalent to a 4.75 magnitude earthquake, making it a test of both nuclear and geological significance. Additionally, the U.S. conducted Operation Sunbeam, a Department of Defense-sponsored operation aimed at providing weapons effects data on low-yield tactical nuclear explosions. Approximately 2,900 DoD military and civilian personnel participated in Exercise Ivy Flats, held in conjunction with Little Feller 1. Lastly, the roller coaster test program was a joint U.S. and U.K. effort designed to gather data on the safety of nuclear weapons in the event of accidental detonation. Unlike most other safety tests, roller coaster was not concerned with one-point safety, but with the hazard posed by the dispersal of plutonium if explosives detonated accidentally. This concern was vividly demonstrated in 1966 during the Palomares hydrogen bomb accident in Spain. Meanwhile, the Soviet Union responded to these U.S. test series with its own nuclear testing programs. Following their 1961 tests, the USSR conducted the K project between 1961 and 1962. These 5 high-altitude tests were fired from Kapustin Yar launch site in Russia, targeting the Sari-Shegan test range in Kazakhstan. Like the U.S., the USSR explored high-altitude nuclear detonations in this project, conducting tests like Joe 109, their first upper atmosphere space test. Although the Soviet K project tests produced smaller yields, up to 300 kilotons, they caused greater EMP damage than the U.S.'s Starfish Prime due to being conducted over populated landmasses where the Earth's magnetic field was stronger, amplifying the EMP effects. The Soviet Union's 1962 nuclear test series, which consisted of 78 tests, following their Project K series. These included air-launched cruise missile tests, the first Soviet underground test, and their last atmospheric nuclear test. The nuclear arms race between the United States and the Soviet Union was not limited to weapons development and testing. It extended into espionage, intelligence warfare, and a series of proxy conflicts through allied nations. These efforts drew the two superpowers closer to direct conflict than ever before, culminating in what became known as the Cuban Missile Crisis. The crisis began when U.S. intelligence revealed that the Soviet Union had secretly installed medium and intermediate-range ballistic missiles in Cuba, capable of striking major cities in the southeastern United States, including Washington, D.C. The revelation was particularly alarming because these Soviet deployments were seen as retaliation for the US's own placement of nuclear missiles in Turkey and Italy aimed at the Soviet Union. This strategic chess match set the stage for a 13-day standoff between the two superpowers from October 16 to 28, 1962. During this tense period, both sides engaged in high-stakes diplomacy. The crisis is now regarded as the closest the world has ever come to full-scale nuclear war. With both sides bracing for potential catastrophe, the resolution came in the form of a negotiated agreement between U.S. President John F. Kennedy and Soviet Premier Nikita Khrushchev. Publicly, the deal stipulated that the Soviet Union would dismantle its missile installations in Cuba under United Nations supervision in exchange for a U.S. guarantee that it would not invade Cuba. However, in a secret part of the agreement, the United States also committed to removing its nuclear missiles from Turkey, though this aspect of the deal remained undisclosed for several years. This settlement was seen as a victory for the U.S. on the global stage, particularly for President Kennedy, who emerged with enhanced political standing. The Soviet Union, on the other hand, faced internal political fallout. Khrushchev, already under pressure from within the Communist Party, was seen as having been outmaneuvered by the Americans. Though the withdrawal of U.S. missiles from Turkey was kept secret, the broader perception was that the Soviet Union had backed down, diminishing Khrushchev's standing in the eyes of the Politburo. He would be ousted from power 2 years later, in part due to the embarrassment over his handling of the crisis. The Cuban Missile Crisis also had significant implications for U.S.-Cuban relations. Fidel Castro, whose regime was a central player in the standoff, found himself somewhat sidelined in the final negotiations between the U.S. and the Soviet Union. While Cuba remained under Castro's control and in alliance with the Soviet Union, the fact that such a high-stakes confrontation had taken place without Cuba's direct involvement in the resolution left Castro wary of both Soviet and American intentions. Internationally, the crisis served as a stark reminder of the fragility of peace in the nuclear age. In response to the near disaster, the Moscow-Washington hotline was established to provide a direct communication link between the Kremlin and the White House, allowing for rapid dialogue in future crises. This was one of the first steps toward a more cautious and measured approach to Cold War diplomacy. In the immediate aftermath of the crisis, efforts to reduce the risk of nuclear war accelerated. The Limited Test Ban Treaty, LTBT, of 1963, signed by the United States, the Soviet Union, and the United Kingdom, prohibited nuclear tests in the atmosphere, outer space, and underwater, though it still permitted underground testing. The treaty reflected the growing global awareness of the dangers of nuclear fallout from atmospheric testing, as well as the urgent need to prevent accidental escalations like the Cuban Missile Crisis. Despite the signing of the LTBT, nuclear testing did not stop entirely. Both superpowers continued to refine their nuclear arsenals through underground tests, as did other nations such as France and China. The latter, not a signatory to the LTBT, conducted its first atmospheric nuclear test in 1964. While the treaty marked a significant step in arms control, it was only a temporary solution to the larger problem of unchecked nuclear proliferation. The Cuban Missile Crisis, while resolving the immediate threat of nuclear war, did not end the arms race. Both the U.S. and the Soviet Union continued to develop and test increasingly sophisticated nuclear weapons. However, the crisis left an indelible mark on Cold War diplomacy, leading to a period of détente, where both sides, wary of repeating such a close call, sought ways to manage their rivalry more carefully. Both the United States and the Soviet Union continued conducting nuclear tests until the 1990s, when the Soviet Union collapsed in 1991. It wasn't until this period that more comprehensive treaties, such as the Comprehensive Nuclear Test Ban Treaty, CTBT, were negotiated. The CTBT aimed to prohibit all nuclear tests, but it has yet to enter into force, as key nations like the United States and China have not ratified it. Nonetheless, the Cuban Missile Crisis remains a pivotal moment in the Cold War, significantly shifting the trajectory of nuclear arms control and the geopolitical balance between the superpowers. From the end of the Cuban Missile Crisis in October 1962 to the fall of the Soviet Union in December 1991, the United States conducted nearly 700 nuclear tests. This included Operation Grommet, 1971 to 1972, which comprised 34 nuclear tests, including Kanakin, the largest underground explosion ever at 5 megatons, detonated under Amchitka Island in the Aleutians. The final U.S. nuclear test series, Operation Julian, 1991 to 1992, consisted of 7 tests, cut short by the negotiation of the Comprehensive Nuclear Test Ban Treaty. Similarly, after the Cuban Missile Crisis, the Soviet Union conducted nearly 500 nuclear tests, with the last test occurring in 1990. The USSR announced its ratification of the Comprehensive Nuclear Test Ban Treaty and ended testing on October 24, 1990. On December 26, 1991, the Union of Soviet Socialist Republics, USSR, was formally dissolved by the declaration of the Soviet of the Republics of the Supreme Soviet of the Soviet Union, marking the end of the Cold War. Following this dissolution, the Russian Soviet Federative Socialist Republic emerged as the Russian Federation, adopting a new constitution that established a federal semi-presidential system. During the Cold War, several nations besides the United States and the Soviet Union conducted their own nuclear tests. The United Kingdom carried out its first test, Operation Hurricane, on October 3, 1952, and completed a total of 45 tests by 1991. France followed suit with its first test, Gerboise Bleu, on February 13, 1960, leading to a significant total of 210 tests until 1996. China entered the nuclear arena with its first test on October 16, 1964, known as 596, conducting a total of 45 tests through 1996. India, on the other hand, conducted just one test during the Cold War, named Smiling Buddha, on May 18, 1974. Each of these nations played a role in shaping the nuclear landscape, contributing to the broader dynamics of the Cold War era. As of now, the United States is estimated to have around 5,000 nuclear warheads, while Russia possesses a little more at approximately 5,500. During the Cold War, at the height of their nuclear arsenals, the U.S. had around 30,000 nuclear warheads, reaching its peak in the 1960s, while the USSR had nearly 40,000, peaking in the 1980s. In the Face of the Apocalypse is a multi-chapter series I am working on. If you enjoy the first chapter, be sure to like this video, leave a comment to let me know what you think, and subscribe to catch all the upcoming chapters.